model view controller. So let's get started. So here are some basic points which we will be covering in this presentation, which includes a description of MVC, methodology of MVC, and how it is working with technologies, and we'll look for its benefits. So what is model view controller? It's nothing but a software design pattern that separates three major concerns of any application: the user interface, the data, and the business logic. It's not specific to a single programming language. It's the way how you organize your code. It is not like a specific thing for Ruby, PHP, or Java, or Apex. It's all about how you organize your code. Hello? Yeah, sorry. There are three distinct components: model, view, and the controller, which works for each other but without any dependency on each other. So let's first understand what are they. Hello? Hello?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
Deepak, you are audible.
Yeah, actually there is a network issue. So what is model view controller? It is nothing but a software design pattern that separates three major concerns of any application: the user interface, the model, and the business logic. It is not specific to a single programming language. It's all about how you organize your code. There are three distinct components: model, view, and the controller, which works for each other but without any dependency on each other. So let's first understand what are they. The model. Model is basically a kind of component which is responsible to handle the data. Your data would be something fetching up from an API request or maybe from the database, and your model should be the guy or component who should deliver the data. And model contains all of your data logic that is not contained in view and controller. Obviously, it is directly associated to the data. So let's talk about the view. As the name suggests, the view represents the information in a suitable format to the user. So it's basically software component that contains a template or data form and produces a response for the end user, as you can see here. So the controller. The controller is responsible for controlling the application logic and acts as the coordinator between the view and the model. The controller receives an input from the view and then processes the user data with the help of the model and passes the result back to the view. This is the model basic use of the controller in MVC design pattern. Basically, it handles incoming request, retrieves necessary model data, and return appropriate response to the view. So here I can do a little bit better job in explaining what model view controller is with a day-to-day story of everyone. Now let me try to explain that what model view controller is, where you see this in your day-to-day life. So let's try that. So just this is you. You move to a restaurant to have some food. Now what do you do at restaurant? You don't just go to the kitchen and make a food by yourself. You can do that at your home, but you will not do it in a restaurant, obviously. So what you will do, you will wait for a waiter to come on. Now waiter comes to you, you just order the food to the waiter. The waiter just get the order from you, and now waiter moves to the kitchen. Now in the kitchen, waiter is not going to prepare your food. The food is prepared by the cook. So let's bring our cook into the film. Now waiter will tell the cook, hey, there is a guy out there and he wants this kind of food. Now cook is the guy who is going to prepare the food for you. But cook did not prepare the food by magically. He needs some ingredients to cook the food. He will open up the fridge, will put out something to prepare your order and whatever it needs. So cook will prepare the food. Now cook will hand over the food to the waiter. Now it's the job of the waiter to move those food outside the kitchen. Now waiter is actually aware that what kind of food needs to be served to you and how it should be served. Like there is need to be add something else to the food or nothing. So waiter comes back to you, you serve your order. You might be wondering, hey, what is this story all about? And probably you might have guessed that, but this is all your model view controller in day-to-day life. So let me show you how that works on. So this view is basically a view, and the waiter guy is actually the controller, and this cook guy is our model. And you haven't guessed that, yes, the fridge is actually the data. So how about that? The real world model view control pattern. And this kind of thing you see every day in your life. You have been going to the restaurant usually, and they are following a model view objective throughout the year. So this is the concept of basic concept of model view controller. So this is a basic control flow which model view control follows. The user performs an action on the interface. The controller takes the input event. The controller notifies the user action to the model to get the data. Model responds to the controller with some information, and controller adds its business logic and updates the view with the response. So let's talk about MVC in Salesforce. So the model, as we know, model is just database layer. So Apex classes as objects are fulfilling it. The schema and data Salesforce used to represent the system completely. In Salesforce, we can say that as objects are model, as every entity in Salesforce is mapped to some as objects. View is just user interface layer. Our Visual Force pages, our Lightning Web component, our Aura components, HTML, CSS part is used to present the data to users. And controller is basically business logic layer. Controller are used to perform actions whenever user interact with user interface with suppose HTML, CSS in components like our favorite JavaScript, but it completely depends on our design strategy. Like we can even use Apex to behave as a controller. So this is brief introduction on MVC in Salesforce. So how MVC working in the backend? Like you might be thinking that there is not any user interface in the backend. If we talk about in the backend, so how will MVC help us there? As I'm continuously mentioning that MVC is all about separation of concern, which helps to separate three major tasks of an application. Like we just need someone to handle database logic and persistent data storage, the model, something to handle the representation of the use case to the end user, our view, something else to handle the business logic, use case, and utilize the whole thing, our controller. I would like to give an example. Suppose we are having a server application. In that server, an incoming API request is simplest example of for you. Like it demands some response from the controller. So to fulfill that, the controller asks model to give some raw data. Then controller process and filter the data with business logic add as endpoints requirement or demand. So the endpoint is filling basically the views role here. So what are some benefits of using model view controller? Separation of concern, basically rapid application development, because we are dividing our application into three components. So parallel development can be possible there. Scalability, yes. And support for multiple views. Because of the separation of model view from the view, the user interface can display multiple views for the same data at the same time. And apart from this, the whole advantage of this approach is you can write dumb code. Dumb code is basically a code that programmer can easily understand the code even without any explanation. And yes, the more is going to be dumb, it's going to be more beneficial. What I mean by that? So now all I'm trying to say that we are trying to reduce the dependency of each code files. Like suppose there is two files, first file and second file. So each other we want that some data is being passed to first file. It just processes the data and shouldn't be worried about from where the data is coming, or there shouldn't be any dependency between these code files. It just needs the data, fetch the data, and responds some appropriate response. In our example, in the hotel restaurant's example, we can see that our cook is not actually worried about who is ordering the food. It's a male or female, it's a kid or adult. He doesn't really care. He just get the order and cook the food, and that's it. So that is actually a dumb way of separating the work from each other and tasks. So, but let me give you also an example of this kind of approach is good in most of the places, but in some places it can be opposite of that. Like, for example, if there is a store which sells the Pepsi or ice cream, it would be really bad approach if we use model view controller there, because there is just one job to do. Just bring the ice cream from the fridge and serve it. Basically, it would be overuse and overkill of the resources. So at some point of time, the model view controller is not a good approach, but in most of the cases where application is pretty big, then it's a good idea to use model view controller approach to organize our code. So to summarize it, model view controller is not dependent on any specific programming language. It's all about separation of concern. So what I mean, what it means that separating an application into distinct sections. So each section addresses a separate concern. We just so here we just took brief introduction of model view controller, because suppose if I'll be taking an example of Android, then definitely it will not be a good example for iOS. And if I'll be taking an example of iOS, then definitely it will not be a good example for Android. So all I'm doing is trying to generalize the thing as much as possible. Now, one thing I would like to mention that a lot of people misunderstood one thing. Like that a model is the data, but as I mentioned in the restaurant example, model is a kind of person which is responsible to access or deliver the data. The data is completely separate thing. It needs to be cooked up, right? So that's what our cook is doing in our example. And in the real world development example, your data would be something fetching up from an API request or maybe from the database, and your model should be the guy who should process the data. And finally, controller should be responsible for taking the data from model, filtering the request, and implement its business logic to process the data depends on views requirement. So, so I think that's all from my side.